when the whole town wanted him dead. Only the wild creature wanted him to live. There are moments in life when you realize the people you fought for don't deserve what you gave them. For Elias Walker, that moment came in a diner in Silver Creek, Montana, when the mayor knocked a cup of scalding coffee onto the only proof that could save his best friend's life. 3 years ago, Elias was supposed to die in a blizzard. He'd walked into the wilderness with his father's revolver, ready to end the nightmares that followed him home from Afghanistan. But he found something in that storm, something bleeding and broken, caught in a steel trap, waiting to die alone. A wolf with eyes like winter fog. Elias freed the wolf. The wolf stayed with him. They saved each other that night. Two abandoned souls choosing life together when death would have been easier. Now, someone powerful wants to take that away. Someone who knows that fear is easier to sell than truth. That a dead animal makes a better story than a living conspiracy. Mayor Harlan has framed Ghost for a crime the wolf didn't commit. And the whole town believes him because believing is easier than questioning. Elias has 24 hours. 24 hours to prove his friend's innocence, or watch him die. 24 hours to stand against a town that's already decided which story they want to hear. But here's what they don't know about Elias Walker. He's already died once in that blizzard. He's already given up everything for his country, his family, his sanity. And a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous thing in any wilderness. This is the story of loyalty that runs deeper than blood, of truth that costs more than lies, of a bond between man and wolf that will be tested by corruption, violence, and the kind of evil that wears a friendly face and shakes your hand before it destroys you. What happens when the monster isn't the one with fangs? The coffee was still steaming when Mayor Harlan knocked it into the photograph. Elias watched the brown liquid spread across the image, warping the face of his only proof. The diner had gone quiet in that particular way small towns do when violence is about to become entertainment. Forks stopped midway to mouths. The waitress froze with the pot in her hand. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow its rotation, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Sheriff Dutch leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, that same expression he wore every time Elias came to town. Not quite contempt, not quite pity. Something worse. Something that suggested Elias was a problem that would eventually solve itself if everyone just waited long enough. The photograph had shown the cattle clearly. The lesions on their hides, the foam at their mouths, the way their eyes had rolled back white with fever. Not the clean tears of predator teeth, but the rot of disease. Spreading from the Fletcher Ranch to the Morrison place, creeping closer to town, with each passing week. Elias had spent 2 days documenting it, his hands steady for the first time in months as he focused the old camera his father had given him before Afghanistan. Now the image curled at the edges, coffee-stained and ruined. Harlan's voice cut through the silence like a blade through winter air. He was a big man, the kind who'd played football in high school and never quite accepted that those days were gone. His hands were clean, manicured even, nothing like the ranchers whose land he'd been buying up piece by piece for the last 5 years. "The only thing you and that animal bring to this town is bad luck," he said, loud enough that everyone heard, loud enough that they were meant to hear. Elias felt the weight of their stares. Betty Morris clutching her purse tighter. Tom Chen turning his son's face away, as if madness might be contagious. Even Father Michael, who preached forgiveness every Sunday, found something fascinating about the salt shaker on his table. He'd known this would happen. Had known it the moment Ghost started following him into town 6 months ago, trailing 20 paces behind, never begging, never threatening, just there. A gray shadow with eyes like winter fog. The town had tolerated Elias when he was just the broken veteran living in the woods. They'd even felt charitable about it, leaving casseroles on his porch that he never asked for, nodding sympathetically when they saw him at the general store, as if kindness from a distance could absolve them of actually caring. But Ghost changed things. A wolf, or near enough to one that the distinction didn't matter to people who'd grown up on stories of Little Red Riding Hood and livestock torn apart in the night. Never mind that not a single animal had gone missing in the 6 months since Ghost appeared. Never mind that the old Jameson dog, mean as hell and twice as big, had learned to give the wolf a wide berth after one silent confrontation that left both animals unbloodied but understanding their places. Fear didn't need facts. Fear just needed a target. Elias picked up the ruined photograph, coffee dripping between his fingers. He looked at Harlan, really looked at him, and saw something flicker in the mayor's eyes. Not anger, not righteousness. Something closer to calculation. The expression of a man playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. "You done here?" Dutch asked, his hand resting casual on his belt, close to where the pistol sat. Elias stood slowly. His knees ached from the morning cold, from sleeping on a cot that was 10 years past needing replacement, from old injuries that the VA kept promising to look at someday. He was 42 but felt 60, and some mornings he wondered if that wasn't a gift. If maybe time was trying to rush him toward an ending he'd been too cowardly to choose himself. The diner erupted in nervous laughter as he turned toward the door. Someone muttered something about crazy, and someone else agreed, and just like that the tension broke into something meaner, something that felt like permission. Elias pushed through the door into February cold that bit at his exposed skin. The main street of Silver Creek stretched out before him, lined with the same buildings that had been there since his grandfather's time. The hardware store where he'd bought his first pocket knife. The pharmacy where Linda Martinez still remembered everyone's birthday. The church with its white steeple pointing up at a god who seemed to have better places to be. He'd defended this place once. Not this town specifically, but the idea of it. The thought that somewhere back home, places like Silver Creek still existed, where people knew their neighbors and helped each other and gave a damn about something other than themselves. He'd carried that idea through Kandahar, through Helmand Province, through firefights that turned boys into ghosts and ghosts into statistics. What a stupid thing to have believed. Ghost was waiting at the edge of town, where the pavement gave way to dirt road. The wolf sat on his haunches, patient as stone, watching Elias approach with those pale eyes that seemed to see straight through to the parts of him that were still broken. Elias didn't look back at the diner. Didn't need to. He could feel their eyes on him, feel their relief that he was leaving, feel the way they'd already started forgetting him before he'd even disappeared from view. But he'd seen something they hadn't. In that moment when Harlan's hand knocked the coffee cup, when the liquid splashed across the photograph, Elias had caught the mayor's reflection in the diner window. And Harlan hadn't been looking at Elias with disgust or anger. He'd been looking at him with the cold satisfaction of someone who just eliminated a problem before it could grow into something bigger. The cattle were dying of disease, not wolf attacks. Elias knew it, had documented it, and someone had just made sure that evidence would never see the light of day. He fell into step beside Ghost, and together they walked toward the tree line, toward the cabin that wasn't much but was his, toward the silence that felt more honest than anything he'd heard in that diner. The wolf's limp was barely noticeable anymore. Just a slight hitch in his left hind leg from the trap that had nearly killed him 3 winters ago. 3 winters ago, when Elias had been standing in different snow with a different piece of metal in his hand, and the ghost had chosen life for both of them. Behind them, Silver Creek went back to its breakfast, its gossip, its comfortable certainty that it knew how the world worked. Ahead of them, the mountains waited, patient and indifferent and honest in their cruelty. Elias preferred the mountains. The call came at 2 a.m, which meant it was bad. Sheriff Dutch pulled his truck up to Harlan's property with the engine still ticking hot, his headlights cutting through darkness, thick as wool. The snow had started falling around midnight. Those fat flakes that meant the temperature was climbing, that meant whatever tracks existed would be gone by dawn. What was left of the heifer lay in the center of the north pasture, maybe 200 yards from the main barn. Dutch had seen plenty of dead cattle in his 20 years wearing the badge. Heart attacks, bloat, the occasional lightning strike that left them smoking and stiff. But this was different. This was theater. The animal had been opened throat to belly, its inside steaming in the cold air, already starting to freeze in ropey coils. Blood had sprayed in an arc across the snow, black under his flashlight. Pattern suggesting the killing blow came from something low to the ground, something that knew exactly where to bite. Harlan stood at the edge of the scene, his ranch coat hanging open despite the cold, his face doing that thing it did when he was performing grief for an audience that wasn't there yet. Behind him, the lights in the big house burned yellow and warm, his wife's shadow moving behind lace curtains that probably cost more than Dutch made in a month. "That animal cost me $18,000, Harlan said, his voice carrying across the pasture. "Championship bloodline. I had buyers coming from as far as Texas to look at her calves." Dutch crouched near the carcass, his knees popping. The tracks circling the body were clear enough, canine, big, the kind that would make any rancher reach for a rifle. But something about the scene bothered him, something he couldn't quite name. The blood was too spread out, the entrails too carefully arranged, like someone had taken the time to make it look worse than it needed to be. He was still studying the tracks when he heard the barn door scrape open behind him. Benny Thornton emerged from the shadows like a ghost himself, 16 years old and skinny as a fence post, wearing clothes too thin for February and boots that had been resoled twice. The kid had been working for Harlan since his father ran off with the grocery store clerk 6 months back, leaving Benny and his mother with rent they couldn't pay and pride they couldn't afford. The boy's eyes went wide when he saw the heifer, and something flickered across his face that Dutch had learned to recognize in 20 years of watching people lie. Not shock, not horror. Something closer to confirmation, like seeing proof of something he'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. "Get back to the barn," Harlan snapped, his voice sharp enough to crack ice. "This isn't something you need to see." But Benny was already backing away, his gaze darting between the dead animal and something beyond it, toward the equipment shed that sat dark and silent at the property's edge. Dutch followed the boy's line of sight, but saw nothing except corrugated metal and shadows. "I'll need to make a report," Dutch said, standing up, his lower back complaining. "Take photographs. Maybe call in someone from the county to look at this." "What you need to do," Harlan said, turning to face him fully now, "is go get that psycho and his wolf before I lose my whole herd. 24 hours, Dutch. That's all I'm giving you. After that, I'm handling this myself." Dutch had known this was coming. Had known it the moment he saw the carnage. Maybe had known it before that. Back in the diner when Harlan knocked that coffee cup and everyone pretended it was an accident. The town had been looking for a reason to deal with Elias Walker, and now they had one wrapped up neat with a bow. Except wolves didn't usually work alone, and they sure as hell didn't gut their kills like something out of a slasher movie. They ate what they needed and moved on. Efficient predators doing efficient work. This felt personal. This felt human. But Dutch had learned a long time ago that truth was less important than consensus, and Silver Creek had already decided what it wanted to believe. He drove to Elias's place as the sun was starting to turn the eastern sky from black to gray, that in-between time when the world felt suspended between dreaming and waking. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by pine, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin column that meant Elias was already up, probably had been for hours. Ghost appeared first, materializing from the tree line like smoke taking shape. The wolf's eyes caught the headlights, reflecting green and ancient, and Dutch felt his hand drift toward his sidearm before he stopped himself. The animal just stood there, watching, making no move to attack or retreat. Elias came out onto the porch a moment later, barefoot despite the snow, wearing the same thermal shirt he'd probably slept in. His hair was longer than it used to be, gray threading through the brown, and he had the kind of stillness that came from years of watching horizons for movement that might kill you. Dutch got out of the truck slowly, hands visible, the way you approached something wild that hadn't decided yet whether you were threat or prey. Harlan's prize heifer got torn apart last night, he said, skipping the pleasantries they'd both stopped pretending mattered years ago. Lots of blood, lots of wolf tracks. Elias didn't move, didn't react, just stood there with his arms loose at his sides and his eyes on Dutch's face. You have 24 hours, Dutch continued, hating the words even as he said them, hating himself more for saying them. Either you put that animal down yourself, or I come back and do it for you. The silence stretched between them, broken only by wind moving through pine branches and the distant call of a crow announcing the morning. Ghost had moved closer during the conversation, was now sitting at the base of the porch steps, his shoulder nearly touching Elias's leg. You know it wasn't him, Elias said finally, his voice rough with disuse. You know it, Dutch. And the hell of it was. Dutch did know it. Could feel it in his gut the same way he'd felt things go wrong in Iraq before the IED went off, before the shooting started, that animal sense that something wasn't right even when everything looked fine on the surface. But knowing and proving were different countries, and Dutch had stopped trying to cross that border a long time ago. He got back in his truck without another word, turned it around in the clearing, and drove away. In his rearview mirror, he could see Elias still standing on that porch, still motionless, with Ghost beside him like a shadow that had learned to breathe. Back at Harlan's property, Benny waited until the barn was empty before slipping into the equipment shed. His hands were shaking as he pushed aside tarps and bags of feed, searching for the thing he'd seen the mayor cleaning in the dark hours before dawn. He found it wedged behind a stack of fence posts, wrapped in an oilcloth that smelled of metal and blood. When Benny pulled back the fabric, his stomach turned cold. It was a piece of farm equipment he didn't recognize, modified somehow, its edges sharpened into points that looked almost like teeth, almost like jaws, almost like something that could make a killing look like nature's work instead of a man's choice. Benny stood there in the dim light, filtering through dirty windows, holding proof of something he didn't fully understand but knew down to his bones was evil, holding evidence that could save a man's life and a wolf's life and maybe his own soul. And knowing that if Harlan found out he'd seen it, none of those lives would matter anymore. The clinic sat at the southern edge of Silver Creek, a converted gas station that still had the old pumps out front like monuments to a different era. She was the only vet within 50 miles, which meant she saw everything from prize cattle to kids' hamsters, from horses worth more than her truck to barn cats that nobody claimed but everybody fed. She was doing inventory when Elias walked in, the bell above the door announcing him like an accusation. She knew what he wanted before he opened his mouth, had known since Dutch called her at dawn, asking if she'd be willing to do a necropsy on Harlan's heifer. Professional courtesy, he'd called it, making sure we have all the facts. She'd said yes because that's what you did when the sheriff asked. Because facts mattered. Because somewhere under the weight of small-town politics and the exhaustion of single motherhood, she still believed her job meant something. Elias stood in the waiting room, looking like he'd aged a decade overnight. His hands were clasped in front of him, not pleading but close to it. And Sarah felt something twist in her chest that might have been sympathy or might have been guilt for what she was about to do. "I need you to examine the carcass," he said, his voice steady despite everything. "Really examine it. The bite patterns, the wound depth, everything. It wasn't Ghost. It couldn't have been." Sarah glanced at the examination room where the heifer's remains were laid out on a tarp, the smell of death and formaldehyde mixing into something that coated the back of her throat. She'd already done a preliminary look, had already seen what Elias needed her to see. The wounds were too clean, too precise. The tearing looked wrong, the angles inconsistent with canine jaw structure. She'd worked with enough predator kills to know the difference between what nature did and what something else made to look like nature. "I'll do a full workup," she said, meeting his eyes. "Give me until this afternoon." The hope that crossed his face nearly broke her. After he left, Sarah spent 3 hours documenting everything. She measured wound depths, took photographs from every angle, made careful notes about the inconsistencies she found. She built a case that would exonerate Elias and his wolf, built it carefully and thoroughly the way she'd been trained to do. Then she sat in her office staring at the framed photo on her desk. Emma, age 9, gap-toothed and grinning, holding the spelling bee trophy she'd won last spring. Emma, who rode her bike home from school every day at 3:15, who took the same route through town that everyone took because Silver Creek was safe, because nothing bad happened here, because neighbors looked out for each other. The phone rang at exactly 2 o'clock. "Dr. Chen." Harlan's voice was smooth, friendly even, like they were discussing weather instead of death. "I understand Elias Walker was by your clinic this morning." Sarah's hand tightened on the receiver. Through her window, she could see Main Street, could see Emma's school 3 blocks away, could see the bike rack where her daughter would be in exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes. "Just routine?" she managed. "Professional examination?" "Of course." A pause, long enough to let the silence do its work. "You know, I've been thinking about that bike route Emma takes. Past the old Hendricks place, through that stretch where the trees get thick. Beautiful ride in the daytime. Gets awfully dark by 4:30 though, doesn't it? This time of year." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. "A girl that age, riding alone," Harlan continued, his tone conversational, almost concerned. "You hear about things happening. Not here, of course. We take care of our own in Silver Creek. We protect what matters." The line went dead. Sarah sat there with the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the dial tone, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Emma's picture, looked at the examination report on her desk, looked at the choice being offered to her in a language so clear it didn't need to be spoken out loud. Save a man and his wolf, or protect your daughter. Save the truth, or save the only thing in this world that mattered more than truth. Her hands were shaking when she picked up the pen. They were still shaking when she began rewriting the report, changing measurements, altering conclusions, transforming evidence into something that would give Silver Creek what it wanted to hear. By the time Elias returned at 4 o'clock, Sarah had composed herself, had practiced the words until they came out smooth, professional, regretful. She handed him the modified report with steady hands and eyes that wouldn't quite meet his. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it in ways he would never understand. "The wounds are consistent with a large canid, most likely a wolf." Elias took the report slowly, his calloused fingers careful with the pages, like they might disintegrate if he held them too tight. He read it once, then again, and Sarah watched understanding move across his face, like weather. He set the papers down on her desk and looked at the photograph of Emma. Really looked at it, his eyes taking in the details, the bike helmet hanging on the handlebars in the background, the school logo on her shirt. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle. "You're a good mother," he said. "But you just killed an innocent soul." He walked out without closing the door behind him. And Sarah stood alone in her clinic, surrounded by the tools of her profession, the degrees on her wall, the oath she'd taken to do no harm. Outside, she could hear the school bell ringing, could hear children's voices carrying on the afternoon air, could hear Emma's laugh among them, bright and unaware and safe. Sarah put her head in her hands and cried for the first time since her divorce. Cried for choices that weren't really choices. For courage she didn't have. For the man walking away and the wolf that would die because she loved her daughter more than she loved the truth. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to coals by the time Elias made it back to the cabin. He fed it another log without thinking, watched the bark catch and curl, the flames finding purchase in the dry wood. Ghost lay near the hearth, close enough to feel the heat, but not so close as to be uncomfortable, his gray coat almost silver in the firelight. Elias sat on the floor beside him, his back against the wall that still held the cold from outside. His fingers found the notch in Ghost's left ear, the scar tissue rough under his touch. And the wolf's eyes slid, half closed, in something that might have been contentment or might have been resignation. 3 years. Had it really been 3 years? The memory came whether he wanted it or not. The way memories did when you'd spent enough time trying to forget them. February again, always February in this God-forsaken place. The month when winter stopped pretending it might end and settled in for the long haul. He'd been living in the cabin for 6 months by then, if you could call it living. The VA had given him pills that made him sleep, but filled his dreams with fire. His ex-wife had taken their daughter to Portland and stopped returning his calls. His unit, brothers were scattered or dead. And the ones who were alive didn't want to talk about the things they'd seen, the things they'd done, the line between hero and murderer that turned out to be thinner than anyone wanted to admit. The gun had been his father's, a Colt revolver that still smelled like oil and old leather. Elias had cleaned it that morning with the kind of focus he used to reserve for mission prep. Breaking it down, checking each component, reassembling it with hands that didn't shake, even though everything inside him was shaking apart. The blizzard had come in fast, the way they did in the mountains, turning the world white and formless. He'd walked out into it with the Colt heavy in his coat pocket, walked until he couldn't see the cabin anymore. Until he was surrounded by nothing but wind and snow, and the kind of silence that felt like the universe holding its breath. He'd knelt in a clearing, the snow already past his knees, and pulled out the gun. Put it to his temple. Felt the cold metal against his skin and thought how easy it would be. How quick, how it would look like he'd just gotten lost in the storm. Just another casualty of winter in Montana. That's when he heard the sound. Not a howl, not a growl, just a whimper so small and broken it barely carried over the wind. He'd found Ghost 20 yards away, caught in a steel leg trap that some asshole had set illegally and then abandoned. The wolf's left hind leg was mangled, bone visible through torn flesh, blood freezing as it dripped onto the snow. The animal should have been thrashing, fighting, trying to chew its own leg off the way trapped predators did. Instead, Ghost had just looked at him with those pale eyes, exhausted, defeated, waiting for whatever came next. Elias had stared at that wolf for a long time, the gun still in his hand. Two creatures that the world had decided were done with. He'd thought about how easy it would be to shoot them both, put them out of their misery, and two stories that didn't have happy endings anyway. But then Ghost had done something Elias still didn't understand, still couldn't explain to anyone who asked. The wolf had dragged himself forward, trap and all, scraping through snow and blood and agony, until he'd reached Elias and collapsed against his legs. Not attacking, not begging, just choosing somehow to die next to another living thing instead of dying alone. Elias had felt something crack open inside his chest, some frozen place that had been solid since Kandahar. He'd put the gun away and spent the next 4 hours working the trap open with numb fingers, his body sheltering the wolf from the worst of the wind. Both of them shaking with cold and shock and something else neither of them had names for. By the time he got the trap off, his hands were bleeding and Ghost was barely conscious. He'd carried the wolf back to the cabin, following his own tracks before they disappeared, moving on instinct and stubbornness and the sudden, absolute certainty that if this animal died, something important would die with it. He'd spent 3 days keeping Ghost alive, feeding him water from a dropper, cleaning the wound with supplies meant for humans, sleeping on the floor beside him in case the end came and company mattered. On the 4th morning, Ghost had lifted his head and looked at Elias with clear eyes, had stood shakily, testing the bandaged leg, had walked to the door and waited, patient, for it to be opened. Elias had opened it, expecting the wolf to disappear into the forest and never return. Had stood in the doorway watching Ghost limp to the tree line, watching him pause there and look back once before vanishing into the pines. He'd gone inside feeling more alone than he'd felt in the clearing with the gun. 3 hours later, Ghost had come back, had scratched at the door until Elias opened it, had walked inside like he'd lived there all his life, had curled up by the stove and gone to sleep. He'd been there ever since. Elias looked at the wolf now, at the gray muzzle starting to show white, at the scars they'd both earned just by surviving. He thought about what the vet had said, about the choice he was being given. Put Ghost down himself, or let Dutch do it. Kill the thing that saved his life, or watch someone else do the killing. When people wanted me dead, he said quietly, his voice rough in the silence. You wanted me to live. Ghost's ear twitched, the notched one, the one that would always carry the mark of the trap. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, throwing snow against the walls. The fire crackled and shifted. The clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight, toward the end of the 24 hours, toward choices that felt less like choices, more like sentences being carried out. Elias pulled his coat tighter and closed his eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. It never did anymore, not without the pills. And he'd stopped taking those months ago after he'd woken up with his hands around Ghost's throat, still fighting a war that had ended years ago in a country thousands of miles away. So he sat there with his only friend, watching the fire burn down, watching the hours slip past, and wondering which was worse. Dying alone in a snowstorm with a gun to your head, or living long enough to see everything you loved taken away piece by piece. Elias returned to the clinic just before noon, driven by something that wasn't quite hope, but wasn't surrender either. Maybe it was just the need to hear it said out loud, to have the verdict delivered face to face instead of over the phone or through Dutch's reluctant messenger service. Sarah was waiting for him in the examination room, standing beside a steel table that held the modified report in a manila folder. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and there was a coffee stain on her white coat that looked fresh, like her hands had been shaking when she poured it. She didn't make him ask, just picked up the folder and held it out to him, her fingers trembling slightly despite the professional mask she was trying to maintain. "The wounds are consistent with a large canid attack," she said, her voice flat, rehearsed. "Most likely a wolf. The bite radius, the depth of penetration, the tearing pattern, it all matches." Elias took the folder, but didn't open it. He was looking past her, at the desk visible through the open doorway, at the photograph sitting there in its wooden frame. Emma Chen, gap-toothed and smiling, wearing a helmet decorated with butterfly stickers, her bike visible in the background. The pieces fell into place with the quiet certainty of a trap closing. He'd seen enough intimidation in his life to recognize its aftermath. The way Sarah's shoulders curved inward, like she was trying to make herself smaller. The way she wouldn't quite meet his eyes. The way her hand kept drifting to her phone, checking it, as if expecting a call or dreading one. "How old is she?" he asked quietly. Sarah's composure cracked, just for a second, before she pulled it back together. "That's not relevant to the examination." 9? 10? Elias set the folder down on the examination table, careful, gentle like it might explode. "Does she ride her bike home from school?" "Mr. Walker, I've given you my professional assessment. I'm sorry it's not what you wanted to hear, but the evidence is clear." "The evidence," Elias repeated. He looked at the report, at the pages covered in medical terminology and measurements that would condemn Ghost to death, and him to the certainty the truth didn't matter anymore, had maybe never mattered, was just a story people told themselves so they could sleep at night. He'd killed men in Afghanistan, had called in strikes that turned buildings into rubble and bodies into statistics, had done things in the name of protecting people back home that he couldn't think about without wanting to put his father's gun back to his temple and finish what he'd started in that blizzard. And he'd done it all believing that somewhere, someone was keeping score. That right and wrong existed as more than words. That when you told the truth and did the hard thing and stood up for what mattered, it meant something. Sarah was watching him with eyes that begged him to understand, to forgive, to absolve her of a choice she'd been forced to make. And the terrible thing was, Elias did understand, would have made the same choice in her position, would have burned the world to keep his daughter safe back when he'd had a daughter who still took his calls. That understanding didn't make it hurt less. "You're a good mother," he said finally, and meant it without irony, without bitterness. "But you just killed an innocent soul." He walked out before she could respond, before he could see whatever expression crossed her face, before the anger he was keeping locked behind his ribs could escape and turn into something ugly. The February sun was high and cold, making the snow glitter like broken glass. Main Street was busy with lunch traffic, people moving between the diner and the hardware store and the post office, living their small-town lives, secure in the knowledge that their world made sense and justice existed and monsters were things you could identify and eliminate. Elias stood on the clinic steps and looked at Silver Creek the way a soldier looked at terrain before an assault. Seeing the cover and concealment, the choke points, the places where things could go wrong fast. Seeing it not as home, but as hostile territory. Because that's what it had become the moment Harlan knocked that coffee cup and everyone decided which story they wanted to believe. Ghost was waiting at the truck, sitting patient in the truck bed the way he always did when Elias went inside somewhere he couldn't follow. The wolf's ears pricked forward when Elias appeared, reading his body language the way animals did. The way they had to in order to survive. Elias climbed into the driver's seat and just sat there for a minute, hands on the wheel, engine off, watching Silver Creek go about its business. He thought about the report in Sarah's clinic, about Dutch's deadline ticking down, about Harlan probably sitting in his big house right now, satisfied that all the pieces were falling into place exactly as he'd planned. He thought about the gun in the cabin, the one he'd carried into the blizzard 3 years ago. Thought about how some problems didn't have good solutions, just choices between different kinds of wrong. Behind him, Ghost made a low sound. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl. A question, maybe, or just acknowledgement that they were in this together, whatever this turned out to be. Elias started the truck and pulled out onto Main Street, heading back toward the cabin, toward the mountains, toward the deadline that was racing toward them like a storm they couldn't outrun. He didn't look back at the clinic, at Sarah's shadow visible through the window. Didn't look at the diner where this had all started, or the sheriff's office where Dutch was probably filling out paperwork that would make Ghost's execution legal and official. He just drove, because that's all there was left to do, and tried not to think about the fact that in less than 12 hours, he was going to have to make a choice that would define what kind of man he was, what kind of man he'd become. The kind who kept his promises, or the kind who survived. And he honestly didn't know which one mattered more. Benny Thornton had been awake for 36 hours straight, and the world had taken on that crystalline quality that came with exhaustion and fear. Every sound was too loud. Every shadow held threats. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that modified trap wrapped in oilcloth, its teeth sharp enough to tear through hide and muscle and make it look like something wild had done the killing. He was supposed to be mucking out stalls, but instead he was crouched behind a feed bin in Harlan's equipment shed, staring at the empty space where the device had been. His shift didn't start for another hour, but he'd snuck onto the property before dawn, needing to see it again, needing to confirm he hadn't imagined it in some sleep-deprived hallucination. The oilcloth was still there, shoved behind the fence posts. But when Benny unwrapped it with shaking hands, he found only tools. A wrench? Some wire cutters? Nothing that could rip open a prize heifer and frame an innocent man. Harlan had moved it. The realization hit Benny like cold water. The mayor knew someone had seen it, or suspected someone might, and he'd hidden the evidence somewhere new. Somewhere safer. Which meant Benny had maybe a day, maybe hours, before Harlan figured out who'd been snooping and decided to do something about it. His mother's voice echoed in his head, the same lecture she'd given him every day since his father left. Keep your head down. Don't make waves. We can't afford trouble. She was working double shifts at the truck stop just to keep them in their falling-apart rental. And Benny's job with Harlan was the only thing keeping them from eviction. But he'd seen Elias in town yesterday, walking out of the vet clinic with his shoulders squared and his eyes empty. And Benny had recognized that look. Had seen it on his father's face the week before he left. The look of a man who'd run out of options and was about to do something permanent. Benny had also seen Ghost, waiting in the truck bed, loyal and doomed, and something in his 16-year-old chest had cracked wide open. He waited until Harlan's truck pulled out at 10, heading to town for his weekly breakfast meeting with the county commissioners. Then Benny slipped into the main barn, moving quickly through the familiar space, past the stalls in the tack room and the office where Harlan kept his files. The storage loft was accessed by a ladder that creaked under his weight, each rung announcing his trespass. Benny climbed anyway, driven by something stronger than fear, something that felt like the last chance to be the kind of person his father hadn't been. He found it wedged between hay bales, wrapped in a different cloth now. Darker, less likely to show stains. The device was exactly as he remembered. Worse even, because in daylight he could see how carefully it had been modified, how much thought had gone into making murder look like nature. Benny grabbed it, the metal cold even through the cloth, and started back down the ladder. His plan was simple, stupid, probably suicidal. Get the evidence to Elias. Let the man defend himself with proof instead of dying with dignity. Let truth matter for once instead of money and power, and the comfortable lies that let people like Harlan sleep at night. He was halfway across the yard when he heard the truck. Harlan's foreman, a mean son of a bitch named Curtis, who'd done time for assault in Deer Lodge, was pulling up to the barn earlier than he should have been, probably sent back for something Harlan had forgotten. Curtis saw Benny immediately, saw the wrapped bundle in his arms, and his face went from confused to understanding to something darker in the space of a heartbeat. Benny ran. He didn't think, didn't plan, just bolted toward the tree line with Curtis's shouts chasing him and the sound of the truck door slamming like a gunshot. The property backed up to national forest, thousands of acres of pine and ravine and winter cold that could kill you if you weren't careful. Benny knew these woods, had explored them since he was 8, back when his father still pretended to care. Back when family hikes were something that happened instead of something you remembered with a particular ache of lost things. He crashed through underbrush, the device clutched to his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps that burned his lungs. Behind him, Curtis was closing the distance, bigger and faster and motivated by whatever Harlan paid him to keep secrets buried. Benny angled north, toward the high country, toward the ridgeline where Elias's cabin sat like a lighthouse in the wilderness. If he could just make it there, if he could just show someone what he'd found, maybe it would matter. Maybe truth would count for something. The ravine appeared without warning, hidden by snow and shadow, a split in the earth that dropped 20 feet to a creek bed, frozen solid. Benny tried to stop, tried to pivot, but his boots found ice instead of ground, and suddenly he was sliding, falling, the device flying from his hands as he hit the slope and kept going. He landed hard on the frozen creek, heard something in his leg make a sound that legs shouldn't make, felt pain explode through his body like fire. Above him, Curtis appeared at the ravine's edge, looking down with an expression that held no mercy, no hesitation. Benny tried to move, tried to crawl, but his leg wouldn't work and the world was starting to gray at the edges, and somewhere far away, he could hear Curtis on the phone, his voice calm, professional, reporting a problem that needed solving. The last thing Benny saw before consciousness slipped was the device lying in the snow 10 feet away, its metal teeth catching the afternoon light, evidence that no one would ever see. Proof that would disappear along with him into the winter cold. Then darkness took him, and the forest went quiet. And the only sound was wind through the pines, and the distant call of a crow announcing that something was dying in the wilderness, the way things always did when they got in the way of men with power and plans. The 24 hours were up at sunset, which meant Elias had maybe 30 minutes before Dutch showed up with his service weapon and that apologetic expression that made everything worse. Elias had already packed what little mattered into his father's old rucksack, some clothes, the photograph of his daughter from before the divorce, a tin of coffee that would last a week if he was careful. Ghost sat by the door, watching him move through the cabin with ears forward and eyes alert. Understanding in that way, animals did that, something fundamental was changing. The plan was simple. Head north into the high country before the hunters came. There were valleys up there where a man and a wolf could disappear, where winter lasted until June, and civilization was just a rumor carried on the wind. They'd done it before, those first months after Ghost's leg healed, living off the land and each other's company. And they could do it again. Elias was cinching down the pack when Ghost's head whipped toward the window. The wolf's body went rigid, his hackles rising in a line down his spine, and a sound came from his throat that Elias had only heard once before, 3 years ago in a trap-filled clearing. Not aggression. Distress. Elias moved to the window and saw them coming through the trees. 7 trucks, maybe 8, spread out in a loose perimeter that would tighten into a noose if he waited too long. Harlan's people. The ones who did his dirty work and never asked questions, because questions didn't pay as well as blind obedience. Dutch's cruiser was there too, bringing up the rear, official sanction for what was about to happen. Elias grabbed his rifle, a hunting .308 he'd bought at a pawn shop in Billings, and checked the magazine out of habit more than need. He wasn't going to shoot anyone. Wasn't going to give them that excuse, that story they could tell themselves about the crazy veteran who went down fighting. He'd seen enough killing to know it never solved anything, just created new problems that someone else would have to die fixing. But having the rifle meant they'd take him seriously, meant they'd move cautious instead of bold, meant he might actually get Ghost out before this turned into the kind of bloodbath that would make the evening news. He shouldered the pack and opened the door. Ghost moved beside him immediately, close enough that their legs almost touched, the wolf's body coiled and ready for whatever came next. They made it 50 yards before Ghost stopped. Just froze mid-step, his nose lifted into the wind, pulling in information that Elias's duller senses couldn't detect. The wolf's whole body was trembling now, and the sound coming from him had changed, had become something Elias recognized from those nights when Ghost dreamed, whimpering and twitching, chasing ghosts of his own through landscapes of pain and fear. Ghost turned toward the ravine, toward the drop-off that marked the eastern edge of Elias's property, and began moving in that direction with purpose that had nothing to do with escape and everything to do with something else. Something Elias couldn't name, but could feel in the sudden certainty that nothing was going to go according to plan. Ghost, no. Elias said, his voice low and urgent. We need to move. North, now. But the wolf wasn't listening, was already pushing through brush toward the ravine's edge, his limp more pronounced now from urgency, from something that overrode pain and self-preservation and every survival instinct that had kept him alive this long. Elias followed because what else could he do? Because 3 years ago, Ghost had made a choice to live beside him instead of dying alone, and that kind of loyalty deserved to be answered. They found Benny at the bottom of the ravine, lying on the frozen creek in a spreading pool of blood that looked black against the snow. The kid was conscious, but barely. His leg bent at an angle that made Elias's stomach turn, his lips blue with cold, and his eyes unfocused with shock. Ghost was already scrambling down the slope, sliding and catching himself, driven by whatever he'd smelled on the wind that Elias's human nose had missed. Blood, probably. Pain. The scent of something young and hurt and dying. Elias checked his back trail and saw the trucks getting closer. Saw Curtis and 2 others on foot now, moving through the trees with rifles and radios and the confidence of men who believed they had the high ground. He looked at Benny. Looked at Ghost standing over the boy like a guardian instead of the monster everyone said he was. Looked at his pack, at the rifle, at the clear route north that would save them both if he took it right now. The choice wasn't even hard. Elias dropped into the ravine, his boots finding purchase on ice and stone, and landed beside the boy with his knees screaming protest. Benny's eyes found his, confused and grateful and terrified all at once. Harlan, the kid managed through chattering teeth. He killed the cow. I found the thing he used. I was bringing it to you. Elias looked around and saw it lying 10 feet away, half buried in snow, metal teeth catching what was left of the daylight. Evidence. Proof. The truth that could save them. Lying in a ravine, where no one would ever look for it. Behind him, voices called out. Curtis, probably, coordinating the hunt, tightening the net. They had minutes at most before this became a firefight. Elias couldn't win, and Benny couldn't survive. He looked at Ghost, at the wolf's pale eyes that had seen him at his worst and chosen him anyway. He thought about Afghanistan, about the men he'd left behind, because orders said to, about the weight of those choices that he carried every day, like stones in his pockets. He loaded a round into the rifle's chamber. "We're not leaving anyone behind," he said. Though whether he was talking to Ghost or himself, or the ghost of every brother he'd failed to save, he honestly couldn't say. Ghost's tail moved once, a small acknowledgement. And then the wolf positioned himself between Benny and the approaching hunters, his hackles up and his body language clear. "Come and take them if you can." Elias pulled Benny up onto his back in a fireman's carry that made the kid scream and then pass out, which was probably a mercy. He grabbed the device with his free hand, felt its weight, felt the truth of it. Then he started climbing out of that ravine with a broken boy on his back and a wolf beside him, and hunters closing in from all sides. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounded like his drill sergeant was laughing and saying some variation of, "You stupid son of a bitch. You never could leave well enough alone." The first shot rang out as Elias cleared the ravine's edge. The bullet hit the tree 6 inches from Elias's head, spraying bark and splinters across his face. He dropped behind a deadfall without thinking, Benny's weight driving him hard into the frozen ground. Years of combat training overriding every civilian instinct he'd tried to cultivate in the years since coming home. Curtis's voice carried through the trees, authoritative and false. "We're just here for the wolf, Walker. Let us handle the kid. Nobody needs to get hurt." Elias checked Benny's breathing, found it shallow but steady. The boy still unconscious from pain or shock or mercy. The device was still clutched in his hand, its metal teeth biting into his palm hard enough to draw blood. Evidence that could save them or get them killed, depending on whether they lived long enough to show it to anyone who mattered. Ghost was pressed against the deadfall beside him, low and silent, only the rise and fall of his ribs betraying life. The wolf's eyes were fixed on the tree line where Curtis and his people were spreading out, flanking, using tactics they'd probably learned from the same training manuals Elias had studied a lifetime ago in a different desert. The snow started falling harder, those small flakes that meant the temperature was dropping. That meant a real storm was coming. In another hour, it would be full dark, and in 2 hours, visibility would drop to nothing, which gave Elias an edge if he could stay alive long enough to use it. He pulled the rifle tight to his shoulder and fired once, deliberately high, the crack of the shot echoing off the mountain and announcing that he was armed, that this wasn't going to be as easy as Curtis thought. The return fire was immediate, 3 rifles opening up from different positions, bullets chewing through brush and thunking into tree trunks with sounds like axes hitting wood. Elias was already moving, dragging Benny behind the next cover, his muscles screaming from the weight, from the angle, from exertion. His 42-year-old body wasn't built for anymore. Ghost flowed beside him, gray on gray in the failing light, invisible until he wanted to be seen. They made it 20 yards before the next volley came, closer this time, coordinated. Curtis learning his patterns and adapting. One of Harlan's men, a thick-necked bastard named Reeves, appeared through the trees to Elias's left, his rifle coming up, his mouth opening to shout a warning. Ghost hit him like a freight train. The wolf didn't go for the throat, didn't try to kill, just launched himself at Reeves's gun arm and bore him backwards into the snow. The rifle discharged into the air. Reeves screamed, and Ghost was already gone, disappearing back into the brush before anyone could get a clear shot. But the damage was done. The pack mentality that hunters cultivated, that false courage that came from numbers and firepower, cracked like ice over deep water. Elias heard them calling to each other, heard the fear creeping into voices that had been confident 5 minutes ago. A wolf they could hunt, a veteran defending himself they could understand. Both together, fighting like a team, using tactics and terrain like soldiers instead of prey, that was something else entirely. Curtis rallied them with shouts and threats, got them moving again. But they were cautious now. Jumpy, firing at shadows and each other's muzzle flashes. Elias used the confusion to move higher, toward the ridge where pine grew thick and ravines cut deep enough to hide an army. The snow was coming down heavy now, erasing tracks as fast as he made them, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. The storm he'd been hoping for was arriving right on schedule, and with it, the kind of cover that money and manpower couldn't overcome. He was crossing an open stretch when he saw Curtis step out from behind a boulder, rifle aimed, finger on the trigger. That moment of absolute clarity when Elias knew someone was about to die and couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. The shot came from Curtis's rifle, loud and final. But Ghost had seen him first. The wolf hit Curtis from the side just as he fired, jaws clamping on the rifle stock, wrenching it sideways. The bullet went wide, but not wide enough. And Elias felt the impact like a hammer blow to his left shoulder, felt the meat of him tear and the bone underneath crack, felt the rifle drop from hands that suddenly wouldn't work. He went down hard, Benny tumbling from his back, the device flying from his grip to land somewhere in the snow. The world tilted and grayed, pain washing over him in waves that made Afghanistan look gentle. And through the haze, he saw Ghost standing over Curtis's prone form. The wolf's shoulder dark with blood, his breathing labored. They'd both been hit. Elias forced himself up on his good arm, his vision swimming, and saw what he needed to see. The other hunters were falling back, their nerve finally broken, Curtis on the ground, clutching his arm where Ghost's teeth had found purchase. The storm closing in like a curtain over a stage. He crawled to Benny, checked his pulse, found it still there. Found the device half buried 3 feet away, and grabbed it with fingers that barely worked. Found Ghost limping toward him, favoring his right shoulder where Curtis's bullet had carved a furrow through muscle and sinew. The wolf's eyes met his, and Elias saw understanding, there. Saw the same thing he'd seen in that trap 3 years ago. The choice to keep going, or the choice to stop, and which one mattered more when everything hurt and giving up would be so much easier. Elias got his good arm under Benny and stood, swaying, the world threatening to go black and take him with it. Ghost pressed against his leg, supporting him, guiding him, and together they moved into the storm, into the darkness, into the mountains that had always been more honest than people. Behind them, Curtis was shouting into his radio, calling for help, calling for backup, calling for something that would turn this disaster around. But the storm swallowed his words, like it swallowed everything else. And by the time reinforcements arrived, there was nothing left but blood in the snow and tracks leading nowhere. And the growing certainty that Harlan's simple problem had become something much more complicated. Elias made it a quarter mile before his legs gave out. He laid Benny down gentle as he could, wrapped the device in his coat, and pressed it into the snow beside them. Then he put his back against a pine and let Ghost curl up against his good side, sharing warmth, sharing breath, sharing whatever time they had left. The snow kept falling, covering them like a blanket, and somewhere in the distance wolves were howling, calling Ghost home to a pack he'd left behind to save a broken man who'd needed saving. Ghost didn't answer. He stayed where he was, bleeding and loyal, choosing Elias one more time. The Silver Creek Town Hall had been built in 1897 by optimists who believed the railroad would come through and turn their settlement into something that mattered. The railroad never came, but the building remained. All limestone and oak and the kind of false grandeur that small towns clung to like life preservers. Mayor Harlan stood at the podium, looking like a man who'd spent the night celebrating instead of the truth, which was that he'd spent it on the phone with Curtis, with his lawyer, with anyone who could help contain the disaster unfolding in the mountains. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the 30-odd townspeople who'd shown up for the emergency morning session. Sheriff Dutch sat in the front row, his face carefully neutral, his eyes on the floor. Sarah Chen was 3 rows back, her daughter beside her, both of them looking small and afraid in a way that made Harlan's jaw tighten with satisfaction. The rest were the usual suspects, the ones who showed up to council meetings and church socials and anywhere else they could exercise the small power of being seen. Harlan cleared his throat, his voice carrying that practiced tone of grief and authority he'd perfected over years of public service. "I'm here to inform you that the situation with Elias Walker and his animal has been resolved," he began, pausing for effect. "Last night, during the storm, Walker attempted to flee into the high country. Despite our best efforts to bring him in peacefully, he engaged our men with gunfire. Both he and the wolf perished in the blizzard. Their bodies will be recovered when the weather clears." The lie came out smooth as silk, rehearsed, backed by Curtis's report and the testimony of 6 men who knew which side their bread was buttered on. There'd been no bodies, no confirmation, but in a storm like last night's, absence of proof was proof enough. People wanted to believe the problem was solved, wanted to return to their comfortable certainty that justice existed and bad things happened to bad people. A murmur ran through the crowd, relief mixed with something darker, that collective absolution that came from eliminating a threat before it could threaten you. "In light of this tragedy," Harlan continued, "and the danger Walker's presence represented to our community, I'm proposing we seize his property under County Ordinance 37B, failure to pay back taxes." Another pause. "The land will be auctioned, proceeds going to county improvements," which meant Harlan's pocket once his shell company submitted the only bid. The land was worth nothing for ranching, but perfect for the development he'd been planning. The luxury cabins for rich people from California who wanted to play at wilderness without the inconvenience of actually experiencing it. Dutch shifted in his seat but said nothing. Sarah kept her eyes down. Father Michael opened his mouth like he might object, then closed it again, remembering that his church needed a new roof and Harlan controlled the county discretionary fund. Harlan was reaching for the gavel when the doors opened. The cold came in first, a blast of February air that made everyone turn. Then Elias Walker stepped through, and the room went silent in that absolute way that only shock could create. He looked like he'd crawled out of hell itself. His left arm was in a makeshift sling, blood soaked through the bandaging and dried brown on his coat. His face was gray with pain and exhaustion, his eyes hollowed out by something that went deeper than physical injury. Snow and ice clung to his beard, melting slowly in the heated room, dripping onto the wooden floor like accusations. On his back, secured with rope and sheer stubbornness, was Benny Thornton, unconscious but breathing, his broken legs splinted with pine branches and torn cloth. The crowd erupted. Gasps, shouts. Mrs. Morrison actually screamed, a high sound that cut off abruptly when her husband grabbed her arm. But Elias wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Harlan, and his eyes held something that made the mayor take an involuntary step back from the podium. Behind Elias, the door opened again. Ghost limped through, each step careful and measured, his right shoulder bandaged with the same torn cloth that wrapped Benny's leg. The wolf moved like age had found him overnight, like the bullet that creased his shoulder had taken more than blood, had taken something fundamental and irreplaceable. But his eyes were clear, alert, focused on Harlan with the patient attention of a predator that had already chosen its prey and was just waiting for the right moment. In his jaws, gentle as a mother carrying a pup, Ghost held the device. He walked down the center aisle of the town hall, his nails clicking on hardwood, past people who pressed themselves into their seats to avoid him, past Dutch who'd half risen with his hand on his pistol, past Sarah who'd started crying without sound or apparent awareness. Ghost reached the podium and stopped, looked up at Harlan with those pale winter eyes, then opened his jaws and let the device fall. It hit the floor with a sound like a gavel striking metal on wood, final and absolute. The modified trap lay there in the fluorescent light, its sharpened teeth still holding fragments of hide and frozen blood. Evidence so clear that even people who wanted to look away couldn't quite manage it. The silence was total. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their breath. Elias lowered Benny from his back with his one good arm, laying the boy down gentle on the floor. Someone, maybe Tom Chen, rushed forward to help, to check the kid's vitals, to do something useful in the face of something none of them could process. Then Elias straightened, swaying slightly, and looked at the crowd that had condemned him, that had believed the easy lie instead of the hard truth, that had chosen comfort over conscience. "Your move," he said to Harlan, his voice rough as gravel and twice as hard. And the mayor, for the first time in 20 years of public life, had absolutely nothing to say. Benny woke 3 hours later in the clinic, his legs set and casted, his mother weeping beside the bed. The first thing he said, voice cracked and urgent, was the truth. How he'd seen Harlan cleaning the device. How he'd tried to bring proof to Elias. How Curtis had chased him into the ravine and left him there to die. Sarah Chen stood in the doorway listening, her hands clasped tight enough to hurt. And when Dutch arrived with his notebook, she repeated every word. Added her own testimony about the wounds that didn't match, about the phone call that had changed her report, about choosing her daughter's safety over a man's life and living with that choice ever since. The crowd that had watched in silence at the town hall found their voices then, found them loud and righteous, the way crowds did when the wind changed direction and they could be on the right side without any actual cost to themselves. They called for Harlan's arrest, called for an investigation, called for justice with the fervor of people who'd been complicit in injustice and now needed to prove they'd been victims too. Misled, deceived, never willing participants in the lie. Dutch put Harlan in handcuffs, while the mayor's lawyer shouted about due process and illegal search and seizure. But everyone could see the truth in Harlan's eyes. Not remorse, not shame. Just the cold calculation of a man already planning his next move, already counting on money and connections and the fact that people like him rarely stayed in handcuffs long. The crowd wanted to celebrate Elias then, wanted to shake his hand and slap his back and tell him they'd always known, had never really believed, had been about to speak up themselves before he proved them right. Betty Morris brought a casserole. Tom Chen offered to fix the cabin's roof for free. Father Michael started talking about forgiveness and redemption and the power of truth, like he'd been preaching it all along instead of sitting silent while an innocent man faced execution. Elias stood in the center of the town hall and looked at them all with eyes that held no anger, no satisfaction, nothing but a weariness so profound it seemed to age him another decade in real time. "You only believe the truth when it's convenient for you," he said, his voice quiet enough that they had to strain to hear it. when it costs you nothing, when believing it makes you feel good about yourselves. The celebration died like a candle in wind. Sarah stepped forward, her face wet with tears, her hands reaching toward him in supplication. "Elias, I'm so sorry. I was afraid for my daughter. I know that doesn't excuse it, but please understand I was just trying to protect her." He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened just slightly. "I know," he said. "I would have done the same thing. That's what makes it so goddamn sad." He walked out without waiting for a response, Ghost limping beside him, both of them leaving blood drops on the polished floor like breadcrumbs leading nowhere useful. Dutch caught up with him in the parking lot. "The county will want a statement for the investigation, and the hospital should look at that shoulder before infection sets in. Send someone to the cabin if you need to," Elias said, opening his truck door. Ghost jumped into the bed with effort, settling into his usual spot, patient and ready. "But I'm done with this town, Dutch. I'm done with all of it." He drove home through streets that looked different now. Smaller somehow, like he was seeing them from a great distance instead of from behind a steering wheel. The hardware store, the diner, the church with its white steeple. All of it felt like a stage set, something that looked real from far away, but revealed itself as plywood and paint when you got too close. The cabin was cold when he arrived. The fire long dead, the temperature inside barely warmer than outside. Elias built it back up slowly, one-handed, while Ghost watched from his spot by the hearth. He fed the wolf the last of the elk meat from the freezer, changed both their bandages with supplies he kept for emergencies, and sat down to wait for whatever came next. The town would want things from him. Statements, testimony at Harlan's, trial, maybe even forgiveness, though he doubted they'd be brave enough to ask for that directly. They'd want him to stay, to be their redemption story, proof that Silver Creek was the kind of place where good triumphed and justice prevailed. But Elias had seen enough of the world to know that justice was just a word people used to feel better about the things they did or failed to do. That good only triumphed in stories, and even then, only when the storyteller decided it should. That places like Silver Creek existed everywhere, full of people who were brave when bravery cost nothing, and principled when principles aligned with convenience. He made his decision as the sun set, painting the snow outside the window in shades of orange and gold that were almost beautiful enough to make him forget what beauty cost. That night, Elias moved through the cabin, gathering what mattered. Photographs, his father's revolver, the letters his daughter had sent before she'd stopped sending them. He packed them careful and deliberate, taking his time, giving himself space to say goodbye to the life he'd tried to build here. When everything was ready, he poured kerosene on the furniture, on the floor, on the memories soaked into the walls. He stood in the doorway with a match in his hand and looked at the space that had been home, had been refuge, had been the place where he'd learned that survival sometimes looked like dying and sometimes looked like living, and you couldn't always tell the difference until it was too late. He struck the match. The cabin caught fast, flames climbing the walls like something eager to be free. Elias stood watching until the heat drove him back, until the roof started to cave, until the structure that had sheltered him collapsed into ash and embers, and the kind of ending that felt more honest than anything the town could have given him. Ghost sat beside him, the firelight reflected in his pale eyes, understanding in the way he always understood the important things. When the last beam fell, Elias shouldered his pack and turned toward the mountains. Not north where he'd planned to run before, but east, toward ranges he'd never explored, toward territory that held no memories and no expectations no people who'd think they knew him based on stories they'd told themselves. Ghost fell into step beside him, limping but steady, choosing one more time to follow instead of staying behind. They walked until the burning cabin was just a glow on the horizon, just another fire in a world full of them. Walked until Silver Creek was nothing but lights in a valley that could have been anywhere, could have been nowhere, didn't matter either way. Behind them, the town slept secure in the knowledge that they'd done the right thing eventually. That truth had won. That they were good people living in a good place where bad things sometimes happened, but justice always prevailed. Ahead of them, the mountains waited with the same indifference they'd shown for millennia, offering no comfort but no lies either, which was the closest thing to kindness the world had left to give. Elias and Ghost disappeared into the darkness between the stars. Two broken things that had saved each other once, and would probably have to keep saving each other until saving wasn't enough anymore. And somewhere in Silver Creek, in a clinic bed with his mother holding his hand, Benny Thornton dreamed of wolves with gentle eyes and men who kept their promises even when promises cost everything. The town kept the land, kept their story, kept their comfortable certainty that they were the heroes of this tale. But they lost the only guardian who'd ever cared enough to bleed for them, and they'd never even know what they'd given away until it was far too late to matter. The cabin burned behind them, and Elias Walker walked into the mountains with the only friend who'd never betrayed him. Some might call that an ending, but those of us who've lived long enough know better. Sometimes walking away isn't giving up. Sometimes it's the bravest thing a man can do. What would you have done in Elias's place? Would you have stayed and accepted their apologies? Would you have forgiven a town that condemned you without evidence? Or would you have done exactly what he did? Turned your back on people who only valued truth when it was convenient? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to walk away from people you thought you could trust? Have you ever been betrayed by a community that was supposed to protect you? Share your story. This is a safe place, and I read every single comment. And if this story moved you, if it made you think about loyalty, sacrifice, and what we owe to those who stand by us when everyone else walks away, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, because I've got more stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary choices. Stories about the bonds that hold us together when everything else falls apart. Stories that'll make you feel something real in a world that's forgotten how to feel. Next time, I'll tell you about a widow in Wyoming who discovered her late husband's darkest secret, and the wild Mustang that helped her find redemption in the most unexpected way. Until then, remember, the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. And sometimes the only honest voices left are the ones that can't speak at all. Take care of each other out there. And never underestimate the power of standing up for what's right, even when you're standing alone. I'll see you in the next story.